The wealthy couple who hired me to carry their child called me, to my face, the oven, not a person, an appliance. They were paying for a service, they explained, and they expected the service to be quiet, grateful, and invisible. So when the pregnancy was over and it came time to honor our agreement, they decided that the oven didn't need to be paid in full, didn't deserve the medical coverage they'd promised, and certainly wasn't going to make any trouble about it. After all, what was a woman like me going to do against people like them? What they never bothered to find out was that the quiet woman they'd dismissed as a vessel had read every single word of the contract they'd signed and had kept a record of every promise they broke. My name is Maria Delgado. I'm 33 years old, and this is the story of how a wealthy couple treated me like a piece of equipment, tried to cheat me out of everything we'd agreed to, and learned that the law does not actually care how much money you have when you've signed your name to a contract. Let me explain how I came to be in this situation, because I think people misunderstand women who do what I did. I became a gestational surrogate for reasons that were partly practical and partly something deeper. The practical part: I'm a single mother of 2. I work as a dental hygienist, and surrogacy offered a way to give my own children a stability I'd struggled to provide. But the deeper part matters more. My younger sister spent 6 heartbreaking years unable to have a child, and I watched what that longing did to her. And when she finally held her daughter, through the help of a surrogate herself, I saw something close to a miracle. I decided I wanted to give that miracle to someone else. I remember the day my sister called to tell me she was finally going to be a mother. I had watched her go through years of treatments that failed, of pregnancies that didn't hold, of baby showers for other women that she attended with a smile that cost her everything. I had held her on my kitchen floor more than once, while she cried in a way that frightened me. And then, one ordinary afternoon, she called, and she couldn't even get the words out at first. And when she did, when she told me a surrogate was carrying her child and it was going well, I sat down on the floor myself, right there, and we cried together down the phone. The good kind this time. 9 months later, I held my niece, and I looked at this perfect, impossible little girl, and I thought about the stranger who had carried her, a woman I would never meet, who had given my sister back her whole life. I thought, I could do that. My body does this thing well, easily, when for some women it is the hardest thing in the world. What a waste, not to use a gift like that for someone drowning the way my sister had been drowning. I had easy pregnancies. My body did this thing well. It felt, to me, like a way to do something genuinely good with a gift I happened to have. I want you to understand that I went into this with my whole heart. That is what makes how I was treated still sting, even now that I've won. I signed with a reputable agency, went through the extensive screening, the medical, the psychological, the legal, and I was matched with a couple I'll call the Ashfords, Vivian and Charles Ashford. They were, to put it plainly, extremely wealthy. Charles did something in private equity that I never fully understood, and that earned more in a month than I earned in several years. Vivian did not work. They lived in a world of staff and second homes, and from the very first meeting, it was clear that they understood our relationship as a transaction between a customer and a service provider, which, in a narrow legal sense, it was, but which any decent person knows is also something far more human than that. I'll never forget the first sign of how they really saw me. We were at a meeting arranged by the agency early on, and Vivian was describing to a friend on the phone, not bothering to step away, how the arrangement worked. And she referred to me, while I was sitting 6 feet away, as the oven. "We found our oven," she said, with a little laugh. She seemed sturdy. Sturdy, like livestock. The agency caseworker, a kind woman named Diane, visibly winced. I said nothing, because I had decided to assume the best, the way you do when you want something to work. I told myself it was a careless joke from a nervous woman. I was wrong. It was the truest thing she ever said about how she saw me. Now, here is the part that everyone who has never been through this gets wrong. They assume surrogacy is an informal, handshake sort of thing, governed by feelings. It is the opposite. A gestational surrogacy arrangement, done properly through an agency, is one of the most heavily documented legal relationships 2 parties can enter into. There is a contract, in my case, a contract that ran to over 60 pages. That specifies everything: the base compensation, the schedule of payments, reimbursement for medical expenses, maternity clothing, travel, lost wages, medications, life insurance, a separate fund for legal representation, provisions for bed rest, for complications, for a C-section, Every conceivable contingency, spelled out, signed by both parties, witnessed and binding. And here is the thing about a contract like that. It protects the surrogate at least as much as it protects the intended parents. The Ashfords, I would come to realize, did not believe this. They believed the contract was a formality, a thing their lawyers had produced to make the agency happy, and that the real terms of our relationship were whatever they decided they were, because they were rich and I was not. They signed 60 pages of binding obligations, while privately believing that none of it really applied to them. I read all 60 pages. Twice. I am not a lawyer, but I am a careful person, and this was my body and my time and my children's security on the line. So I read every word, and I asked Diane to explain the parts I didn't understand, and I understood, by the time I signed, exactly what I was owed, and exactly what they were obligated to provide. I remember Diane being almost surprised by how thoroughly I went through it. Most surrogates, she told me gently, skim the contract and sign, because they trust the agency and they're focused on the beautiful thing they're about to do, not on the legal machinery underneath it. She said the intended parents almost never read it closely either. Their lawyers handle it, and they sign where the little tabs are. You'd be amazed, she said, how few people in this process have actually read the document that governs all of it. I told her my mother raised me to read anything before I signed it, even a birthday card if money was involved. She laughed, but I meant it. And it turned out to be the most important thing my mother ever taught me, because in the end, of the 4 people who signed that contract, me, Vivian, Charles, and a witness, I was the only one who actually knew what it said. I also did something that turned out to matter enormously. From the very first day, I kept records, not because I was suspicious yet, but because I am the kind of person who keeps the receipt. Every payment, every medical bill, every expense I submitted for reimbursement, every text and email with the Ashfords and the agency. I kept all of it, organized by date, in a folder, the same way I keep everything. It was just habit. It became my salvation. The pregnancy itself went well. Medically, I carried their child carefully and healthily for 9 months, and I want to be very clear about something, because it matters. The baby was always theirs. That was never in question, never something I would have dreamed of contesting. This is not a story about a surrogate trying to keep a child. The Ashford's daughter was born healthy, and she went home with her parents, exactly as she always should have, and I hope with all my heart that she is loved and well. My fight with the Ashfords was never ever about the child. It was about how they treated the woman who carried her, and whether they would honor the promises they'd made in writing. Those are different things, and I need you to hold them separately, the way the law does. The trouble started during the pregnancy and escalated after the birth. It started small, the way it always does with people who think the rules don't apply to them. There was a clause in our contract requiring the Ashfords to reimburse my reasonable medical and pregnancy-related expenses within a set number of days of my submitting them. I submitted my first batch of expenses: maternity clothing, the copays my own insurance didn't cover, the mileage to the many appointments, and they simply didn't pay. Weeks passed. When I followed up, politely, through Diane, Vivian's response was that the expenses seemed excessive, and that she didn't see why she should pay for maternity clothes when the pregnancy was temporary, as though I could attend my prenatal appointments unclothed. It was a small thing, a few $100s, but it was the first test. They were probing to see whether I would push back. And because I wanted the relationship to work, because I was carrying their child and didn't want stress, I let it go. I covered the expenses myself, and I noted, carefully, in my folder, the date I'd submitted them and the date the payment was refused. That was their answer. From then on, the breaches grew. There was one prenatal appointment I think about often because it crystallized everything. It was an important scan, one the contract specified the intended parents were welcome to attend, and Vivian came, not out of warmth I realized, but out of a kind of ownership. The way you'd inspect a delivery. She spent the appointment on her phone in the corner. When the technician turned the screen to show the baby, Vivian glanced up, said good, everything's on track then, and went back to her phone. She did not ask how I was feeling. She did not acknowledge that the body on the table, the one doing the work she was watching on a screen, had a person inside it. Afterward, in the parking lot, I mentioned, gently, making conversation, that I'd had some bad morning sickness that week, and she said, without looking up, "Well, that's rather what you're being paid for, isn't it?" And she got into her car. I stood in that parking lot for a long moment. I was carrying her child, and I had just been reminded that to her, My discomfort was simply a line item she'd purchased. I drove home, and I wrote the date in my folder, and a single note, V, that's what you're being paid for. I didn't know why I was recording it. I just knew by then that I should be writing things down. When I was put on partial bed rest in my 3rd trimester, a common, doctor-ordered precaution, our contract clearly provided for compensation for my lost wages because I physically could not do my job leaning over patients' mouths all day. I submitted the documentation from my doctor and my employer. The Ashfords refused to pay it. Charles, this time, sent a curt email through their lawyer, suggesting that I was exaggerating my condition and that they would not be taken advantage of by a woman on doctor-ordered bed rest, carrying their child, asking for the lost wages they had signed a contract promising to pay. I read that email 3 times, and something in me, which had been giving them the benefit of the doubt for months, went very quiet and very clear. I stopped hoping they were good people having a hard time. I understood, finally, that they were exactly what Vivian's oven comment had revealed them to be, and that they had decided, somewhere along the way, that they simply were not going to pay me what they owed, and that they were betting I was too powerless to do anything about it. So I did what I do. I stopped arguing, and I started documenting even more carefully. I want to tell you about the worst of it, because it's the moment the story turned. After the birth, after I had delivered their healthy daughter, after a delivery that required a C-section, which under our contract entitled me to a specified additional payment and a longer paid recovery period, the Ashfords went silent. The remaining balance of my base compensation, a substantial sum that was due to be released after the birth, was held in an escrow arrangement, and it required their authorization to release. They simply didn't authorize it. The C-section payment refused. The recovery period support refused. And when I finally reached Vivian directly, recovering from major abdominal surgery, having just given this woman the child she said she'd always wanted, her response is something I will remember for the rest of my life. She said, "Maria, let's be realistic. You've been paid plenty already. The rest is negotiable, and frankly, you're not really in a position to negotiate, are you? We have lawyers. What do you have? What do you have?" I was lying in my own bed, stitched up from surgery, my own 2 children needing their mother, having been called an oven, and cheated of tens of thousands of dollars I was owed, and had earned with my own body. And this woman, in her enormous house, holding the daughter I had carried for her, asked me what I had. I remember I didn't even feel angry in that moment. I felt strangely calm, the way you do when a thing you've been bracing against finally arrives, and turns out to be solid ground instead of a cliff, because the question answered itself the moment she asked it. She thought she was reminding me of my weakness. She was actually telling me, out loud, in a recorded call, that she had no intention of honoring a contract she'd signed. She had just handed me the case. I'll tell you what I had. I had a 60-page contract that she and her husband had signed. I had a folder, organized by date, documenting every single payment they'd promised, and every single one they'd refused. I had emails, in their own words, calling my doctor-ordered bed rest exaggerating and my legitimate expenses excessive. I had the agency, and a caseworker named Diane who had winced at the oven, and who had been quietly horrified watching this unfold. And I had something the Ashfords, in all their wealth, had never imagined a woman like me would have the resources or the nerve to use. I had the contract's own provisions for exactly this situation, because I had read all 60 pages, and I knew that our contract, like most properly drafted surrogacy agreements, contained a provision requiring that disputes be resolved through a defined process, and that the prevailing party in such a dispute was entitled to recover their attorney's fees. I also knew, because I'd read it, that the contract included a separate, pre-funded allowance for my own independent legal counsel the Ashfords were obligated to pay for, that they had agreed to when they signed, and that they had apparently forgotten existed. They had, in the contract itself, funded the very lawyer who would come after them. They were so certain I'd never use it, that they'd handed me the weapon and forgotten it was loaded. I waited until I was a few weeks past the surgery, healed enough to think clearly, and to sit upright through a meeting. I have learned that you do not make your most important moves while you are still bleeding. And then, I called that lawyer. His name was Robert, and he had been recommended through the agency precisely for situations like mine. And when I sat across from him, still sore, my folder on his desk, and walked him through what had happened, he went quiet for a moment, the way careful professionals do when they realize a case is going to be very straightforward. He read Vivian's "What do you have" message. He read the emails dismissing my bed rest. He went through my folder, the dated record of every refused payment, the note from the parking lot. And then he looked up and said something I'll never forget. He said, "Miss Delgado, these people seem to believe that having money is the same as being right. It isn't. They signed this. I've rarely seen a clearer breach. And the best part is, they're going to pay for me too. They already agreed to." He smiled. "Let's send them a letter." I want to describe the shift, because it was remarkable to watch. For months the Ashfords had treated me as something beneath their notice. An oven, a vessel, a powerless woman they could refuse and ignore. The day Robert's letter arrived on their lawyer's desk, that changed completely. Because the letter was not emotional, it did not plead, it simply laid out, point by point, with the contract clauses cited, and my dated documentation attached, every obligation they had breached, the exact sums they owed, the contractual penalties and interest those breaches had triggered, and the provision entitling me to recover my legal fees they were funding. It was not the letter of a powerless woman. It was the letter of a binding 60-page contract being enforced, exactly as written, by someone who had read it more carefully than they had. Their lawyer understood immediately what Vivian and Charles had not. There was no defense. You cannot argue your way out of a contract you signed and then plainly violated in writing, your breaches documented by the other party with timestamps. Vivian's own messages. The rest is negotiable. You're not in a position to negotiate. Her refusals characterizing legitimate claims as excessive and exaggerating were not, as she had imagined, demonstrations of her power. They were evidence. She had spent months building, in writing, the case against herself, exactly the way the powerful so often do when they're certain no one will ever hold them to account. I'm told the first response from the Ashford side was bluster. A letter back implying that they would vigorously defend and that I should think carefully about taking on people with their resources. Robert read it to me over the phone, and I could hear that he was almost amused. "They're doing the thing," he said. "The thing where they confuse the size of the threat with the strength of the case. Watch what happens when their own lawyer actually reads the file." He was right. Within 2 weeks the tone changed completely, because their lawyer, a competent person stuck with terrible clients, had clearly sat them down and explained that a documented breach of a signed contract does not become less of a breach because you can afford a longer fight, and that the attorney's fees provision meant the longer they fought, the more of my legal bill they would ultimately pay on top of everything else. The math of it was brutal and simple, and even Charles, the private equity man, could follow that math. The Ashfords settled. They had no choice. They paid the full remaining balance of my compensation. They paid the withheld C-section and recovery sums. They paid the reimbursements they'd refused, with the interest the contract specified for late payment. And they paid Robert's fees, in full, as the contract had always required them to. By the time it was done, they paid me every dollar I was owed, a sum that came to over $55,000 they had tried to keep, plus the costs their own bad faith had added on top. The oven, it turned out, had been wired to a very expensive contract, and they had broken it. The day the settlement funds finally cleared, I did not feel the triumph I'd expected. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd organized that folder month after month, and I felt mostly a deep, tired relief, and underneath it something sadder, that it had to be this way at all. I had wanted to give these people a miracle. I had carried their daughter with genuine love, and they had made me fight, from a surgical bed, for the dignity of being paid what they'd promised. The money was right, but the having to fight for it never stopped being a kind of grief. Here is what happened after. The Ashfords are, I assume, living their lives, raising their daughter in their large house. I think about her sometimes, not with any sense of claim, because she was never mine, but with hope. I hope she grows up kind. I hope she becomes a better person than the two who made her so wanted, and then treated the woman who carried her so poorly. That is the only thing about the Ashfords I still carry, and it is a gentle thing, and it is about the child, not the parents. I took the money I was finally rightfully paid, and I did exactly what I'd set out to do when I started. I secured my own children's future. I paid off the debt that had followed me for years. I started a real college fund for my son and my daughter, the first money either of them has ever had with their name on it, and a future attached. The stability I had carried another family's child to provide, I provided. The whole point of it, the practical heart of it, came true after all, just by a much harder road than it should have been. And I did one more thing. With Diane, the caseworker who had winced at the oven, I now speak to other women entering surrogacy. First-time surrogates, often young, often from backgrounds like mine, often so focused on the good they want to do that they don't realize they need to protect themselves too. I sit with them before they sign, and I make them do the thing almost no one wants to do. I make them read all of it, every page, out loud if I have to, until they understand not just what they're promising but what they're owed. I tell them the single most important thing I learned. Read the contract. Read every word of it. Keep every receipt, every message, every record, from the very first day, even when you're sure you won't need it. Especially when you're sure you won't need it. Because the contract that the wealthy treat as a formality is, for you, a fortress. They will never read it as carefully as you can. And the day they decide that their money makes them right, that fortress is the only thing standing between you and being erased. I want to leave you with the thing I understood. Lying in my bed after surgery, being asked what I had. People with power and money often make a specific, lazy mistake about people without them. They assume that because you are quiet, you are powerless. That because you are polite, you will be passive. That because you need the money, you can be cheated out of it. They confuse a person's gentleness with a person's options, and so they sign their names to binding promises, while privately believing the promises don't apply to them. Because surely a woman like that, an oven, a vessel, a service, will never have the knowledge or the nerve to hold them to their word. They are wrong more often than they know. The contract does not care how big your house is. The signature does not care how you spoke to the person across the table. And the quiet woman keeping the receipts is very often the most dangerous person in the room, precisely because you decided she didn't count. My name is Maria Delgado. They called me an oven and asked me what I had. What I had was their signature on 60 pages, a folder full of every promise they broke, and the patience to use both. I carried their daughter with my whole heart, and then I held them to every single word they'd signed. If this story meant something to you, stay a while. There are more like it here. Stories about the people the powerful are too arrogant to take seriously, and the calm, patient, perfectly documented moment they discover that a signature means the same thing whether you're rich or not. No shouting, no drama, just a contract, a folder, and a woman who read every word. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.